Many of us now have seen horrific pictures of starvation in Madaya, Syria. However, there's charges that some of these pictures are fake, not from Madaya and not even from Syria. We'll be revisiting the question of the sieges and starvation in Syria. I'll be speaking to Michael Karajas. A few days ago, he wrote a post, "What's at issue in the siege of Madaya? Mass starvation or a few fake pics?" He teaches humanities and social science at Australian Catholic University and the University of Sydney. Good morning.
Good morning.
You're speaking to us from Sydney, Australia, where it's Wednesday morning and midsummer. Now it's midwinter here in Connecticut and a snowstorm is coming, so I have to ask, what's the weather like in Sydney?
Beautiful and warm this morning, Stanley. Thanks.
All right, well, that's going to be the last light question I'll ask you. Now, there seems to be a big effort going on by some people to say that the stories about civilian hunger in Syrian towns under siege is overblown, and in particular that some of the ghastly photos we've been seeing are fake. First question, is there any doubt that people in Syria are starving to death?
Well, there quite clearly isn't any doubt. Yes, there are some false images. As you can imagine, we live in the days of millions of images being produced about virtually anything, and so some of them are false. The majority of them are certainly true, and we've seen Amnesty International, we've seen the United Nations, we've seen Doctors Without Borders, MSN, we've seen countless organisations that have people there in the camps reporting on what's happening. So this isn't just a question of a number of images that are fake. And these organisations are saying, yes, the essence of these images are true. The overwhelming majority are true, and the essence of them is true. Yes, there are people starving to death. MSN, reported as this crisis hit its height that 23 people had died at their facility alone a couple of weeks ago, including children. So the fact that there are some fake images shouldn't stop us from understanding that a genuine tragedy is going on.
All right, so let's talk about those photos. Who is saying that these photos are fake?
Who's saying they're fake?
Yeah.
Well, mostly people who are involved in an international campaign to defend the regime, to defend the Assad regime in Syria. This is a well-organised campaign. It includes people that are obviously directly connected to the regime, but unfortunately it also includes a host of people who have connected themselves to the regime due to what I call a false way of looking at Middle East politics in general, and in particular the Syrian case.
Can you mention some names? I mean, I thought in your article you said Al Akbar. Is that the Lebanese newspaper?
Yeah, well, Akbar is a Lebanese newspaper that's pro-Ba'athist and pro-Hezbollah. It's one of countless examples. I also mentioned an article by someone called Fenian Cunningham in the National Clearinghouse. That's a site that hosts all kinds of articles, which some are okay, but a lot of them are based on this sort of let's say conspiratorial world outlook, which translates into the idea that everything going on in Syria in the last 5 years, the entire uprising against the regime, is one vast conspiracy to get rid of what they consider to be a progressive and imperialist regime. And so you got people writing articles that focus on issues such as a few fake images, as I call my article, because it is a relative handful, while denying that there's a real tragedy going on or to the extent that there is some kind of tragedy, blaming it on the victims, saying that it's the fault of the rebels, claiming that the Syrian regime isn't responsible for the starvation.
Well, let's talk a bit about the bigger picture. So,
Yeah.
in response to all these pictures of Madaya that got worldwide publicity, Hezbollah and Assad forces did allow some food to come in. So, to
Yes.
your knowledge, what's the situation in that town now?
To my knowledge, that the situation is still very, very dire. We're still getting reports of people dying. Now, obviously, the fact that the UN was able to bring in some food is a good thing, and it's some kind of victory of the international campaign to raise awareness about what was going on. Well, we've got to understand. I don't know if you're going to go on to ask me this, but the siege itself is a siege whereby all entry and exit points are closed by the regime. People can't get in and out to get food from somewhere else. They're shot at by those besieging it. So the fact that yes, food was able to go in was a small victory.
Now, what about the bigger picture than that, besides that town? How many places in Syria are under siege?
Well, the information we have is that there's 52 places under siege. 49 of these are under siege only by the regime. 2 of them are under siege by the rebels in Idlib province, and Deir ez-Zor in the east is in a curious position of being under siege by both the regime and by ISIS, Daesh.
So it's a huge problem of hunger in many of these towns and cities. Now, you mentioned... I'm sorry?
Yeah, I was going to say, yes, there is. It's not only Madaya. Madaya is just what's come to our attention in the last few weeks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the thing with these fake images is a lot of these images are actually from other towns that are, so that you could say, okay, well, that's a fake image. That's not from Madaya, but the point is they are literally starving. And even some of the propaganda by these Assadists, will report this is actually from East Ghouta, this is actually from Yarmouk, for example, without realizing that in admitting that, they're actually admitting, yes, that there's lots of other places that the regime is besieging and starving.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was a little confused about 2 of those towns they call Shiite sympathizers with the regime. I mean, Assad forces have an air force and a fleet of helicopters that they use for bombing, but why don't they feed these 2 towns? Why don't they airdrop food?
Well, according to my information, they do airdrop food, and so in that sense, there's the siege isn't as complete and isn't as devastating in those 2 towns as the regime sieges are. That is a difference when you've got an air force. Now, you could argue about the question of the siege. I'm not defending it, but nevertheless, it's certainly not the same thing when a regime can drop in food and arms. Just on these towns, when you're saying Shiite sympathising towns, these are 2 towns that have a Shiite population. They are all also 2 armed regime camps, and so it's not unexpected that a battle goes on anyway. They're in Idlib, which is almost entirely controlled by the rebels, and here's 2 armed regime camps in the middle of it. Now, you could say, well, the rebels instead of trying to take over these towns, they'd be better off trying to reach out to the local populations. But the question of whether they're under siege or not is, I think it's slightly different. A military campaign and actual siege is slightly different. Now, if the claims are true that they are actually under siege, then I think we should also oppose that. We shouldn't discriminate in terms of sieges. Nevertheless, it is different. These towns are not starving. People are not starving to death in these towns. And the problem here is that by putting them all together, this was part of the reason for the delay, that the UN believed it had to be seen as even-handed, and therefore wait until the regime, until circumstances could allow them to get into these two towns at exactly the same time as they got into Madaya, where people were actually dying by the moment as the delay went on.
I wanted to finish. I know we have limited time today, so I wanted to ask if you had seen this article in Bild, a German newspaper, which was reporting on something that was on Russia today, claiming that 300 people had been rescued from Madaya, thankful to Assad troops for saving them from the rebels. And then Bild said that whole thing was a fraud.
Well, the Bild article seemed pretty convincing to me that was a fraud, that was a fake. The regime is the expert on creating false images. They've done it since the outset. They've created entire incidents out of false images. And this one also looks like a false image. It appears to be people that are being organised and essentially bust in. I
The Bild
suppose
article says these people were never in Madaya, and nobody has been able to get out in months and months.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. The article looked pretty convincing to me. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your time. I'd like to continue this and also talk about the United Nations and what it is and is not doing. But we'll have to do that another day.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much, Stanley, and good luck with the campaign over in the US. It's a lot more advanced than here in Australia.
All right. Thank you again, and thank you all who are watching. This is Stanley Heller for The Struggle.
Thank you. Bye-bye.